Good afternoon, good morning, wherever time zone you're in. I am in the Mountain Time Zone. I'm Letha Arnold. I am the pastor of the United Church of Santa Fe, which is a United Church of Christ in Santa Fe, New Mexico. The church was started in about 1980, and I've been here for a good long time of that time. It's wonderful to welcome all of you. I can't see any of you around the screen, but I'm very glad you've joined in today in today's presentation. Emily, can I use the chat thing?
You can, and I can be watching it for you if
Okay,
you can't see it or whatever.
If you wouldn't mind.
Sure.
If all of you who are on the presentation today wouldn't mind signing in and saying where you're from and perhaps what hat you're wearing in this particular and coming to this presentation, then Emily and I can talk about that a little bit down the line. So my presentation today is called Build on Your Strengths, Churches and Mental Health. And I'm very appreciative of the fact that all of you are engaged in this particular workshop today, because I am a strong believer in the role of our faith communities in fostering good mental health and also helping, and particularly helping prevent suicide. So welcome to all of you, and I hope this workshop will be of use to you down the line. It's primarily going to be a PowerPoint presentation, but if you do have questions, please put them in the chat, and Emily will forward them on to me or interrupt me, which is just fine. And we'll also leave some time for Q&A at the end of the session. So again, my name is Talitha Arnold. I'm the pastor of the United Church of Santa Fe in Santa Fe, New Mexico. All right, why is this not moving? There we go. Oops. So as we begin, I'd like to invite you to consider, and the Zoom format is a little bit hard to engage people in the conversation, but to think for yourself just for a moment, what brought you to this workshop today? Why did you sign up for this particular workshop as opposed to any of the other ones you might, or hanging out with a friend, or whatever it is that is bringing you to this particular workshop? If you would think about that just for a little bit. And then if you do want to go ahead and put something in the chat, Emily, as you field those, why don't you go ahead and just sort of read off some reasons why people are here today, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you.
So it says helping prevent youth suicides.
Okay.
I'm waiting for more. I don't really see any more right now. Okay. We have a lot of educators here, just so you know, from all over.
Okay, great.
Multiple suicide, depression, anxiety. Yeah, I think.
Okay, so some of you have firsthand experience in all of this with regard to your roles, whether it's in faith communities or in other places as well.
And Talitha, here's a few more. Just talking about the rise of anxiety for children.
Yes.
Lots of people with mental illness, interest in mental health among youth and children, and just being able to speak to your congregation about it. Interested in accreditation, knowing how the church can help.
Okay. Great. Those are all really good reasons for being here. And I'm delighted you're all here also because my hunch is that 20 years ago, much less 40 years ago when I began ministry, number one, there probably wouldn't have been many workshops like this. And number two, there wouldn't have been as many people engaged in these conversations and talking about these issues openly. So your presence here is a real blessing to all of us, and especially to the people that you serve, to their families, to their colleagues, to all the various communities that people find themselves in. So what else brings us here today? I mean, this is a faith-based session on mental health issues and suicide prevention. So what is in our faith that brings us here today? A couple things I would put out there. One is, oops, let me just do this a little bit. One of the main ones being is the promise of faith, a promise that, oops, that that occurs in the book of Genesis, when Hagar, the enslaved woman owned, quote unquote, by Abram and Sarai, had been exiled out to the wilderness yet for a second time. And she's ready to give up. She's ready to give up both for herself and also for her child. And then there's this wonderful line, then God opened Hagar's eyes and she saw a well of water. And I happen to live in the high desert of northern New Mexico. I grew up in the low desert, Sonoran Desert, Phoenix and Tempe, Arizona. So I know a lot about desert, and I know that seeing a well of water is seeing a lifeline, is seeing God's presence. It's seeing new life. And that's part of what this session is today about. So I'm glad that you're a part of it as we figure out, as we think about what are the deep wells of water, life-giving water, life-giving life that our congregations as a whole, and also specifically children's and youth ministries can offer in this time, and how can we build on that, how we can deepen those wells, and how can we develop new wells as well. No pun intended, sorry. But I also want to begin by sharing what brought me, Talitha Arnold, to this workshop today. One of them is the fact that I've been a pastor for 42 years, which I say good grief. And much of that has been involved in youth and children's ministry. I was an associate minister, first as a student intern back out in Arizona. I was also served a church in Middletown, Connecticut for 6 years as an associate minister, and was very much involved in leadership roles, coordinating roles of youth and children's ministry. And then in '87, when I moved to a small, basically new church start, seven-year-old new church in the United Church of Christ, out here in Santa Fe, basically I was the only staff person. So I typed the bulletin, and I also ran the youth group. But I've always been involved, even as we've built the church and have developed more staff and such, I've always been involved in children's youth family ministry. I think it's a real core in the life of the church, and appreciate the work that all of you who are educators and in your various capacities of ministry also share that ministry. And certainly, if you're working in children's youth family ministry, you're working with mental health issues, you're working with suicide prevention issues as well, in a variety of ways. So that's one reason. Another reason is that in 2010, I was asked to be a founding member of what's called the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention, which was a brand new coalition of 3 U.S. departments, Health and Human Service, Department of Defense, and Department of Veterans Affairs, and also the private sector. And the private sector means everything from the professional organizations like the American Association of Psychiatrists or Psychologists, National Association of Social Workers, and also businesses, the construction industry, unions, other kinds of businesses, and also the private sector in terms of faith communities. And I co-founded the Faith Community Task Force of the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention, because I really do believe faith communities have a very important role in mental health, fostering mental health and helping prevent suicides. And then finally, I'm also brought me to this workshop today, and something that makes me very glad that all of you are part of this workshop is my own family story and my own experience with the church as a young person, growing up many years ago in a church community that I basically dropped out of because of mental health issues that were happening in my family when I was in middle school and on into high school. My family story is, as I said, I grew up in Arizona. My parents had been married before World War II. My mother was a desert botanist and microbiologist. My father had been a desert biologist. After he got out of the Navy and after she finished working in penicillin research after World War II, they did what everybody else had, what everybody else started to do, which was begin a family. My father started working for the Fish and Wildlife Service, both as a researcher and also as a manager of wildlife refuges. So my family lived, this is before I was born, lived in California, Colorado, New Mexico, South Dakota, and then back to Northern California. My father had been stationed on a minesweeper up in the Aleutian Islands during World War II, which meant that half the year he was in darkness. He also had had some other experiences in the war, and that in which he injured his back and also had some other issues. He was discharged before the war's end with a 10% disability due to the back issues and some other things. The reality is there wasn't a word for PTSD at that time. It was called shell shock. It was called battle fatigue. It was something that if you won the good war, which World War II was supposed to be, that you would be okay. Or that if you weren't okay, then the love of your wife, the love of your sister, the love of your mother, or the love of your children, or whatever would heal all wounds. And we certainly know that is not true. About 10 years after that war ended, my father, when my mother was pregnant with me and had 3 other children, older children, my father's, what would now be classified as PTSD, really kicked in. And he was hospitalized in a VA hospital back in California. My mom moved back to Arizona to live with her mother. She had no place to live because they'd been living on a wildlife refuge. 2 years later, he went out on a pass, and according to the coroner's report, died by suicide. I did not learn any of that history until I was 16 years old. My sister did not learn, who's 4 years older than I am, did not learn that history until she was 30 years old, and I told her. But this was the 1960s, early 1970s. You didn't talk about those kinds of things. The other part of it was that just as I was entering middle school, one of my older siblings began to develop some mental health issues, and those became primary issues in my life the whole time I was in middle school and high school. And as I said, was one of the reasons why I really dropped out of church in 7th grade. It had nothing to do with a teenage rebellion. I waited for that till I was in my 40s, and it lasted for about 2 weeks. But church did not feel like a safe place to talk about anything having to do with mental illness, much less suicide or suicide attempts or anything like that, because I never heard it talked about in church. I don't know what your experience was, but I was 28 years old before I heard the word schizophrenia, before I heard the word mental illness, before I heard the word suicide in a sermon. And it was a sermon that I preached as a young associate minister. And my experience as a middle school and high school student was that if the church couldn't talk about those kinds of things, which were very central in my life, and my family wasn't talking about them either, by the way, if the church couldn't talk about those kinds of things, then it felt like God couldn't either. And that, I think, breaking that silence is incredibly important. If we truly believe that there's nothing in life nor death that can separate us from the love of God, then we have to talk about these kinds of things. And I share all that story not to put the attention on me, please. And actually, I share it not even as the reason I went into ministry. I mean, I went into ministry all kinds of reasons. I had no intention of going into ministry. I was going to be a lawyer, but that's a whole other story I'm not going to bore you with. But that over time, because of being a pastor, I kept coming into experiences with other individuals or families, parents, children, siblings, grandparents who were one way or another touched by suicide and touched by mental health issues. And so I figured I'd better start learning more about it. And when I started learning about what the church really had to say about suicide and those suicide, mental health issues, et cetera, I discovered an amazing thing. I discovered stories like that of Hagar, where Hagar is in the wilderness and God has compassion upon her and shows her a well of life. And I discovered even something for me personally, even more important, is how central Jesus's ministry with persons who had some kind of mental illness, how central that was to his ministry. It's another long story about sort of making that just find it. That surprised, for me, very surprising discovery. And my discovery is that there are more stories of Jesus healing persons afflicted with troubled spirits, unclean spirits, demons, all of which I would classify as sort of first century descriptions of mental illness and or spiritual distress than all the other healing stories combined. If you go through the 4 Gospels and you tabulate how many stories of people being healed by Jesus for those various kinds of troubled spirits, unclean spirits, demons, etc., and you match that up, combining persons who are healed, who are lame, who are blind, who are deaf, who have leprosy, all of them together do not equal how many times Jesus heals and cares for someone who is afflicted with basically a first century mental health issue. When I had that revelation, it was when I was a young associate minister back in Connecticut, it was like a whole light bulb went off in my head. And I explored more in terms of those stories about Jesus reaching out, listening, showing compassion, offering comfort and hope. And I began to realize that if we call ourselves Christian, and if the person that is the center of our faith, Jesus the Christ, if healing persons and caring for persons with mental health conditions was so central to his ministry, then probably it might be in ours as well. And that was, so for me at least, another thing that brings me to this work, to this time with you all today, is precisely that fact, that mental health issues are very much in the central position, in a central position within our faith. And if they're that central, then we're not just called to deal with it, we're called to say, this is part of who we are. We can talk about these kinds of things in church. We don't have to hide ourselves from God. We don't have to, these people who came to Jesus for healing, they weren't hiding themselves from Jesus. And so however it is you understand God at work in your life, you don't have to hide yourself in order to, you don't have to clean up your act. You don't have to hide a mental health issue of any kind in the relationship with God. I mean, how liberating can that possibly be to all of us? So that's another thing that brings me here today. So what are some goals for today? Well, these are some questions that are some issues that I'd like to invite us to be involved with. And one of them being background on sort of why include faith communities in suicide prevention and mental health issues to begin with. Mental health and suicide is a public health issue and concern for our congregations, especially in this time. What do we need to know? What are dimensions of mental health issues and suicide, et cetera? Changing and also to know what the changing beliefs and attitudes are about mental illness and suicide, whether within our own particular tradition, whether we're Reformed, Presbyterian, UCC disciples, sort of the Reformed Protestant tradition, but it's also important for us to know what's going on in other people's traditions, Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, because the kids that we serve, the families that we serve, are certainly going to be interacting with kids, families of other traditions as well. It's important that we know what's the conversation these days. Number 5 would be multiple ways that faith communities can help in suicide prevention, and then how the pandemic has changed our practices and perspectives. And so those are all sort of some of the basic goals for today. Well, what are the most important goals? Twofold. One of the most important goals is to remember that our faith communities and our ministries of education are wells in the wilderness. Please never take your work for granted. It is life-giving. I know from my own experience, I owe my life to all kinds of teachers, whether they were in the church or in other settings. We are wells, you are wells in the wilderness, no matter what your role is. And two, to help deepen and to expand those wells. One of the things I titled this presentation, Building on Our Strengths, because I don't want to, oftentimes mental health programs, just like other programs, come into churches and, oh, we've got to start a whole new thing. Well, what I'd like to help you do, what I'd like for us to do today is to begin to think about what are the things we're already doing? What are the things your congregation, your setting, your community are already doing that foster good mental health? How can you build on those things? And I hope that will be helpful, as well as add to it, but not to come in and say, give you one more thing you've got to do. I'm a pastor. I'm always being told one more thing I need to do. And after a while, I know I just don't do them. So that's my hope, is to be able to expand on those things. Let me stop just for a second. Emily, is there anything coming up in the chat that I need to pay attention to?
Not right now, no.
Okay. I hope this is helpful to people thus far, but if it's, so yeah, I hope it's helpful thus far. Okay, so a question: why include faith communities in suicide prevention and mental health concerns? Number one, suicide affects people across all faith traditions. It doesn't matter if you are Muslim, Hindu, Jewish, Native, Indigenous, Protestant, Presbyterian, UCC, Roman Catholic, whatever. Suicide and mental health situations affect people across all faith traditions. And also, no matter what our faith tradition, suicide attempts, suicide ideation, mental health issues as a whole can be and are crises of faith. And what I mean by that, again, I go back to my own experience with dealing with such issues in my family. Was, why I remember, actually, this was when I was an associate minister. We did a whole series of, the senior minister with whom I was working one Lent decided that we ought to do a whole series of preaching sermons in Lent on the healing stories that Jesus was offering, or the healing stories of Jesus, healing people who were lame or blind or whatever. Well, we were a good sort of liberal, mainline Protestant, enlightened congregation. And so we weren't dealing with the real issues of healing and miracles. It was sort of like, well, somebody might be blind, but they were reconciled to their condition, or they found inner peace. If I heard that word once with regard to healing story, Jesus's healing stories, I heard it a million times. And I finally sat down with the senior minister and said, I can't do a sermon on that, because the issue for me was, when my own growing up, it wasn't whether or not somebody was going to find inner peace about some kind of physical, cancer or a heart disease or whatever. The lack of inner peace was precisely the issue when it came to the issues that my family was facing, whether with my father's suicide or with the other mental health issues in the family. And so it was the whole question of, where is God in the midst of a mental health crisis? And so faith communities need to be part of that conversation. But equally important, that faith communities offer all kinds of assets and strengths. Number one, we are on the front line. We are on the front line with the people that we serve. We see them on a Sunday morning. We see them in our youth groups. We see them at a community work day. People serve on committees and boards that we are responsible for. It's not that people have to call and make an appointment to come see us. We're out there. We may be out there in the wider community with these people. And so therefore we're far more accessible in many ways than perhaps other professionals. Secondly, we care for the whole person and families. that, you know, if you're working with a youth in your youth ministry program whose parent has just lost their job, you know who that parent is. You know that that parent's going through a difficult time. You're not dealing with just the high school student or just the middle school student. You're working with the whole family. And that's a very important aspect of all of this. We also interact with people in diverse settings from diverse backgrounds, across generations, different workplaces. The diversity of pastoral ministry, I think, is one of, for me at least, is one of its attractions. And we also have a voice, and therefore we have a responsibility for advocacy in our wider communities. Churches can be on the forefront of breaking the silence and also advocating for all kinds of mental health issues. But to be honest, sometimes faith traditions and faith leaders and faith communities have been part of the problem when it comes to addressing mental health issues. That in many traditions, up until fairly recently, mental illness has been seen as a sin or a moral failing or God's judgment or a test of faith. If you only prayed enough, you would be okay. What did you do? Instead of what I call the Job's friends answer, you know, Job, what did you do to to bring all this disaster upon your head? So mental illness has often been seen as a sin, moral failing, etc. And also that, and if it hasn't been condemned in some, as it has been in some faith traditions, then there's just silence and secrecy around mental illness and suicide. Oftentimes when I'm working with groups, I talk about, you know, I didn't grow up in a setting in which mental illness or suicide or schizophrenia or whatever was condemned, but nobody talked about it. And the silence was deafening for the reasons that I said earlier on. So we just don't talk about it, means that God can't talk about it either. And also, sometimes we've been part of the problem because we've focused only or solely on the individual or the family without engaging the systemic issues that impact mental health and suicide. For example, racism, gender discrimination, gun violence. Churches can have a role in that, but if we don't accept that role, then we can sometimes be more part of the problem. We can be good and caring, but if we're not addressing those systemic issues, we're missing the boat. However, the good news is that many faith traditions have changed their understanding of mental health issues and especially of suicide. In my work with the National Action Alliance, I've done presentations at as diverse places as Saddleback Church, the big mega church in Southern California, and the Muslim Mental Health Institute, which is a national mental health organization. And I've learned in both settings, say for example from Muslims, is that whereas at least in some Muslim teachings, mental health issues are still seen as God's judgment, but more and more Muslim imams, social workers, and other leaders in their communities know that mental health issues and suicide, that actions need to be based on the basis of competency, of being of sound mind, and that therefore there is no judgment, and instead mental illness is being seen like other diseases. Whether one, I mean, as my mother and I used to talk about when we both got older, was if my father had died of cancer or heart attack or any other kind of diabetes, it wouldn't be a reason for shame or guilt or a sign of God's disapproval. The silence is being broken, and clergy across the board, as well, and clergy and other congregational leaders are beginning to see their role as partners with other mental health professionals. Sometimes we're the ones who have to take the initiative, but we are equal partners in those conversations and in that work. And again, faith communities are finding a voice to address systemic issues, whether it's inequality in access to mental health resources, the need for mental health training for police, the new 988 number that's out. The Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention had a major role in getting that done, and also addressing systemic violence. Why be concerned as well? It's a 10th, this is data from 2020, and I realize that is now 3 years ago. But one of the challenges with mental health issues and also suicide in particular is that it's up to the individual coroner in each county, many of whom don't have any kind of either medical background or mental health background or whatever, to determine the cause of death. And oftentimes, in order to protect a family, quote unquote, the death of someone who has died by suicide is listed as something else. And it also takes a very long time to get accurate data from all of those multiple, however many thousands of counties we have in this country. So these are statistics from 2020 from the CDC. It's the 10th leading cause of death in the US. And in ages 10 to 34, which is the cohort that all of you are working with, suicide is the second leading cause of death. A little bit higher, it's the fourth leading cause of death. As also is a public health concern because more women, interestingly enough, more women attempt suicide than men, but 4 times more men complete suicide than women. One of the reasons is the means of suicide. Men are more likely to use a gun. Women are more likely to do other things, either use pills or other kinds of ways that allow for which take longer to happen and allow for some kind of intervention. In 2020, 1.2 million people in the US attempted suicide. And so and I know, again, from my own experience, that if a loved one, a family member, a colleague, a friend attempts suicide, even if it's not, quote, completed, or not, even if it doesn't result in the death of the person, that has a ripple effect among the person's community. And so you've got 1.2 million people who've attempted suicide, but also that number grows exponentially when you realize how many people are touched by that. And my hunch is that some of you around this virtual screen, this virtual table, know that for a fact. You may have had somebody in your youth group who attempted suicide, and the ripple effect among other teenagers, or among other parents, or among other families is incredible. And then so even the suicide attempts, the cries for help can have a very difficult impact on others. And then finally, twice as many people die of suicide than homicide each year. And most of those, and the majority of suicides, of completed suicides, are completed with a gun. That's just that is a bare bones scientific fact, unfortunately. And that, as I said, the public health concern includes the impact of those attempts. And that has, that public health concern has also become, the statistics are still being gathered for 2021 and 2022 because of COVID and other things that have been happening. But the pandemic increased the risk factors for suicide and mental health issues just exponentially. It increased it because of loss of loved ones, unemployment, all the economic upheaval, the social isolation, and then also the lack of access to social services. People couldn't get to where they needed to go. It also had the pandemic also severely disrupted our faith communities. And a Johns Hopkins study has verified the impact of having to shelter in place, canceling of services and connection as being a major factor in the increase of mental health issues because of the pandemic. However, in 2020, there wasn't a spike in overall US suicide rates. And people were sort of surprised by that. Because people thought, well, with this, that would naturally be the case. But you got to parse out. We have to parse out mental health data, just like we have to parse out physical health data, because the good news changes when race, age, I'm sorry, it's in there twice, age or economics are factored in. Because the pandemic truly exposed the country's fault lines of poverty, healthcare, housing, hate crimes, and a number of other factors that impact mental health. We saw that time and time and time again in terms of who died most from COVID, but also means who was impacted most in terms of mental health. Local studies, this is one small study out of Maryland, well, one out of local studies in Illinois, Maryland, Connecticut, showed an increase in suicide rates among communities of color in 2020. There was a Johns Hopkins study in the first 2 months of the lockdown, the pandemic lockdown, April and May of 2020, and found that the number of suicides of Black Marylanders doubled in comparison with the previous 3 years. During that same time, the number of suicides of white Marylanders decreased by half. And that's a huge shift, because prior to the pandemic, at least there was the higher rate of white men dying by suicide than Black men dying by suicide. But that really shifted as a result of the pandemic, And in terms of youth and children data, this is the most recent one as of 2022. Suicide is the second leading cause of death among people ages 15 to 24 in the United States. And a significant number of school students high school students report serious thoughts of suicide. 9% have made an attempt to take their lives, according to the National Alliance on Mental Illness. 9%, almost 10% of the people that we serve, the people of this country who are in their adolescence, have actually made an attempt. That is a huge statistic, and the impact on families and communities is devastating. Also, the suicide rate among pre-adolescents is spiking, although it's not completely clear what's causing that increase. It's unlike, say, a death by cancer, or death from cancer, or death from heart disease. Determining what has caused the rate to increase is very complex. It's quite complex. And also, another thing that has come out of the last 3 to 4 years, although the trends toward them were certainly in place prior to the pandemic, but there's been the impact of communal grief on communities. And one of them being the Native Indigenous communities, Native American and Native Alaskan communities. Even before the pandemic, teenagers in those communities had a much higher rate of mental health issues and suicide than their white counterparts. But the COVID was absolutely devastating, because it meant the loss of the elder generation. We saw that here in not so much among the Pueblos, because they were able to shut down because of the way that they lived together. Whereas the Navajo Diné homeland, they were just devastated by the suicide rate. One of those reasons, devastated by COVID, and that then has resulted in an increase in mental health issues. One of the reasons for the devastation from COVID was 30% of Navajo Diné homes in the Navajo reservation don't have running water. So if you're telling people to wash their hands 6 times a day, and they're having to haul water 30 miles, 40 miles, that's just not going to happen. And you've got intergenerational families and all kinds of things. So there's been a real loss of the elder generation to COVID, but in turn that has had mental health implications for younger people. There's also the impact of, there's also been the impact of the of people immigrating to the United States, or trying to immigrate to the United States, either due to the pandemic or to violence, but then the violence continuing on or the pandemic continuing on in their homeland. India was a good example of that. Certainly Honduras, we have people in our congregation who fled Honduras because of the violence. And but they're concerned about their families, both in terms of COVID and also in terms of violence back home. And also certainly the ongoing threat of racial or gender violence, driving while Black, walking while Asian. I mean, certainly we've seen that just in the last 2 weeks. And I'm not telling you all anything you don't know, but I cannot imagine what it must feel like to be African American, to be Asian American, to be Hispanic American, to be Native American in this culture, increasingly as the violence has manifested itself, or to be LGBTQ, especially trans these days. All those things impact people's mental health and our teenagers' mental health. And I think that in some ways, I mean, I've talked a lot about the pandemic. I don't believe that we're completely out of it by any means. And also my experience is that this third year of pandemic life may be more emotionally risky than the first two. The year that we're in, partly because of cumulative exhaustion, partly because mental health and faith community resources, staff, volunteers, financial resources are stretched thin. I don't know about your congregation, but we're trying to do more. We have to do more in order to keep programs going where we have fewer volunteers and fewer staff. Life's not going to go back to normal, whatever that might mean, anytime soon, if it ever does. The sort of ongoing anxiety about, the triple threat now that we have. It wasn't just COVID. Now it's COVID, RSV, and the flu. And also the next year effect. My own experience as a pastor and even personally is that sometimes the second and third year after a loss is harder because the reality of loss sets in and the support that comes immediately after the loss decreases as time passes. And I think we're seeing that with our congregations, with our teenagers. They stepped up to the plate that first year. They were glad to get back to school last year. This year is a whole different enchilada, as they say. I don't know if that's true in your settings as well. Emily, any feedback or thoughts?
Not right now. We can wait and see if people post any.
Okay. So simply in the wilderness of the pandemic, endemic, the wells of hope, faith, justice, love that our communities offer, I think are more important than ever. I realize that's a lot of data, but I guess I thought it was important to just do a reality check about what we're up against and why this is such an important issue. So you got your role as leaders and community leaders are crucial. Let me just run through, some of you may not know this information already, but I find it very important to just do some suicide prevention basics in a presentation like this. The first one is to be prepared and help prepare your congregation, your youth group, your children's ministry, help do a lot of mental health education, share it in communication, continue to acknowledge the fact that kids and parents in particular are running on empty these days, and we need to be aware of that. If someone talks of suicide, take it seriously. If they've attempted it previously, that increases the risk again. One of the things I think that is very important to understand is that persons who are suicidal or having a mental health crisis, they can often feel ambivalent about dying. They just want the current pain to end, which I think is an interesting thing. It's not I want to die, I just want the pain to stop. And I think that for our kids, that's a big issue. I mean, adolescence is a time of lots of pain. You know, my boyfriend, my girlfriend, my significant other breaks up with me. I don't get into the college I want to get into. I get cut from the team, or my team gets disbanded because of COVID. It just feels like the pain is overwhelming. People want the pain to end, not necessarily their life to end. And if it's the pain that needs to end, we can do something, we can help with that. Things like comfort and support and such. And also that when persons are in a mental health crisis or they're suicidal, they have tunnel vision. We can't see beyond the pain that we're in. We can't see that there are other options. I mean, I remember one of the very first funerals I did for a young person who died by suicide, guy who his girlfriend had broken up with him, and he found his father's gun and he put the bullet through his head. And one of the parents of one of the other kids was saying, you know, when you're that age, you don't know that the sun's going to come up tomorrow. And I think that the role we have as faith leaders is to remind kids the sun will come up tomorrow and we will be with them. To help expand that tunnel vision, that they're more than the pain that they're feeling. And I also, however, think that kind of tunnel vision, number one, got increased by the pandemic, but it also gets increased by racial injustice and economic uncertainty. I mean, I know I've been following what's been going on in Memphis. I imagine others of you have as well. And to experience an attack on a young man who is of your community, talk about tunnel vision. It's sort of like, you know, what hope is there? And all of us have a role in addressing such issues and offering not Pollyannish hope, but true hope. Then finally, asking a person about their suicidal feelings provides an opportunity to get help that may save a life. A lot of times there's a concern that, oh, if I ask the person, are you feeling suicidal? Or do you feel like taking your life? That we're planting the seed. The data shows that no, asking the question breaks the silence and helps the person begin to talk about things. So don't be afraid to ask someone, are you feeling suicidal? Are you feeling like you want to end your life? Because that keeps the conversation going. Hope that makes some sense. Another thing that we, as youth leaders, clergy, whatever, we also, by virtue of being on the front line with young people, children and or their parents and or youth, is to identify risk factors. I'm not going to go through all of these. I think you all have got a PDF of this slideshow, so you've got this information. But I want to stress the one that is in red, that a major risk factor for mental health issues and suicide is chronic stress or anxiety for oneself or for loved ones. If I'm a 15-year-old and I'm seeing my parent or my parents having to work so hard just to keep a roof over our heads, then that can oftentimes lead to a sense of, you know, they would be better off if they didn't have one more mouth to feed, or if I were just a better person or whatever. So chronic stress, not just for oneself, but for one's loved ones or one's family, is a significant risk factor in either suicide or significant mental health issue. And these are just some very quick warning signals. Again, I'm not going to go through them all. Feeling hopeless, or listen to what people are saying. Are they talking about feeling hopeless? Are they talking about feeling trapped? And also, are they talking about being a burden to others, like their parents? Or is a parent talking to you about being a burden to their children? You know, they'd be better off if I were dead. that those are all different kinds of warning signals. Additional warning signals, things like increased use of alcohol or drugs, anger, all those kinds of things. However, seeing these warning signs, seeing the warning signals is 10 times more difficult these days than it had been previously, because of social isolation, because sometimes we're wearing masks, because sometimes the kids haven't come back to the programs that we're offering. And so your job as educators and family ministry leaders, et cetera, is at least 5 times, if not 10 times harder than it was in February of 2020. Yeah, because we just don't see people, you know. I mean, certainly during the height of the pandemic, not being able to see people come through the line, but even now, we still require masks. Our sanctuaries are very small. Just identifying who's there, or you know, is somebody at home? Is a young person not coming to something because A, they've got COVID, B, they're depressed, C, they've moved, or whatever is going on. It's just harder to figure all that out. So think about some ways. How have you and your faith community stayed connected over the last 3 years? Has it been through Zoom? Has it been through outdoor activities? Has it been, you know, coming together in worship, but having to wear masks? One of the things I invite you to do after this session is over is set aside some time and just think about how your own ministry has changed since February of 2020. What changes have you had to make in order to keep people connected? I mean, my congregation, I had always referred to our congregation as we're a high touch church, not a high tech church. And the education, the learning curve for getting onto Zoom, live streaming, the whole enchilada was just exponential. But other ways of connecting as well. One of the things we've done at United is, because we don't have kids coming back as much, I mean, to the same level that they were before church, I mean, before the pandemic, one of the things we've had to do is to figure out, okay, how can we stay connected? One of the things we're doing, in fact, we're doing it this afternoon at the church, is we started once a month what we call family supper bags. We couldn't get families to come to church for a monthly dinner, which we used to have. But what we're doing instead is inviting parents to drop by and pick up a supper bag that has lasagna or burritos or some kind of entree and apples and dessert and some kind of salad mix that they can take home for their family. So that, I mean, I remembered growing up in a single parent family, Friday night was the hardest, you know, because everybody's exhausted. So we were trying to figure out how do we help parents and kids. Our goal is to let parents and kids know God loves them and the church loves them. How do we do that? With some burritos on a Friday night. It's a way of staying connected. It also allows me and others on the staff to connect with parents, even if they just come in for 5 minutes. Sometimes they end up talking for 15 or 20 minutes to pick up a bag, but then, you know, how are you doing? We have a conversation we don't have on a Sunday morning or any other time. So think about the ways that you and your faith community have stayed connected. I'm not going to go through this. It's on the PDF that I sent out. But what to do if someone is actively or threatening suicide. I do want to do this. What I do want to highlight this is know in advance what your game plan is, what your resources are. So hopefully, maybe you already know that, but if you don't, sometime after this session is over, take time and think about these questions. If you're concerned about somebody in a mental health crisis, who do you call? Who can you call? Therapists, social workers, counselors, etc. What would you do? What would be your game plan? Who will support the person? Who do you have you can call on to support the family? And who's going to support you? So just sort of think in your own mind, or even write it down. you know, who your own web of support is in order to work with someone who is in a mental health crisis or a family that's in a mental health crisis. Whom can you call? I hope all of you know about the 988 number that has just come into being since last July. So that if somebody is in a mental health crisis, you don't call 911, you call 988, because it's a different group of people that will come. And calling 911 activates the police. Sometimes this is nothing against police, but sometimes they don't always have the training to help de-escalate a mental health situation. So 988 puts you in touch with a mental health crisis line and a suicide prevention line. 988. Get that number out in front of your congregation, get it to your parents. You know, if a parent is dealing with a child that is having a mental health crisis, threatening violence against themselves or against others, don't have them call. They don't call 911, they call 988. Let parents know that. Then this is just how to make a referral. The main thing is to let them know that you're going to be with them. I don't mean that you're going to be with them every day, but that the church, your community, you as a faith leader, you as a youth leader, you as a children's ministry leader, whatever hat you're wearing, you're there for them, and to the best of your ability, you follow up, and that they'll stay in touch. You'll stay in touch. One of the things with, not just with teenagers, but it's an important aspect with teenagers, is dealing with the resistance to mental health treatment. And there's all kinds of reasons for it. Number one is acknowledging the problem. No teenager wants to say they've got a problem. No adult wants to say they have a problem either, but especially teenagers, when you're trying to figure out your identity and everything else. The stigma around mental health issues, past experience someone might have had with medication, whether or not there's a support team that is helping them, and also religious concepts. I mean, as I said, I grew up for myself personally, I grew up in a mainline Protestant church, and didn't hear any direct condemnation of mental illness or of me because of a family member having a mental illness. Number one, because they didn't know about it. But my religious concept was that there was something that I was doing that was causing my family member to behave as they were. And that was a religious concept. This was God's way of punishing me for something, or making me stronger, or something like that. So there's resistance to mental health treatments. And I think that you as a youth minister, as a youth director, as a children's minister, family minister, whatever your title, educator, I think what is most helpful in my experience as a pastor is you as a faith leader, your own expression that the person can find strength, can find help, and they can take the next step to their healing. That they're not sick, bad, crazy, stupid, but that they are a child of God, and that God wants them to be well, and that you will be there to support them, and the church community will be there to support them in that journey. I think I'd like to just skip down to the bottom one, that I've already talked about theological positions changing, but that you as children's and youth ministry leaders, educators, you can create a faith culture of understanding and openness. My hunch is, I'm not telling you something you aren't already doing, but just over and again, letting people know it's okay to talk with you or to seek professional help. There's no reason for shame. There's no reason for guilt. These kinds of things happen. Additional ways? Yes. I'll get through this hopefully quickly. Number one, these are some strengths that I think that we can build on in our faith communities. We're intergenerational. We have young people, older people, middle-aged people, all interact, or hopefully all interacting with one another. That is a tremendous strength to build on in your faith community. Again, we work with families, we work with couples, not just with individuals. And also studies show that people are more likely to seek out a faith leader, such as a children's minister or youth pastor, than a therapist, at least initially. You can be the link to, if they need additional help, you can be the link to that help, but they may seek you out first because you're accessible, because they know you, because they trust you, because they know you love them. That faith traditions offer messages of hope and reasons to live. And they also sometimes offer injunctions against suicide. And we also offer connection, youth groups, Sunday school, worship, service, advocacy, study groups. And you you know your flock. You know if somebody's checking out or you haven't seen them for a while, and you reach out. Those kinds of connections are life-giving. And also people will more likely attend a presentation at their faith community, whether it's in person or online, than at a clinic or at a college. So if you do something for parents, for example, on mental health, mental health resiliency or whatever, they may come to that at your church. They may not go to it at a different place, like a university or a clinic or whatever. And also that faith communities provide multiple protective factors for mental health care: connection and community, educational opportunities, narratives of hope, worship, and advocacy. Real quickly, I'll get through these. Connections and community, youth groups, Sunday school, children's church, choirs, including youth choirs, children's choirs, or praise bands, or whatever. If you don't show up for rehearsal, people notice. And that's really important. Parenting groups, outreach and advocacy, communities of ministry. We have our youth group once a month cook for one of the shelters. Some communities do walks for mental health. We do cleanups down at the Santa Fe River, which is not a river, it's a creek by your standards, wherever you are, other than in the desert. And service trips. I mean, you all know the value of those if and when they start being allowed again. Service trips, mission trips, immersion trips, whatever you want to call them, of the kinds of friendships that get developed, and camps, and those kinds of overnight events. And also we provide connections and communities through our frontline leaders, nursery caregivers, teachers, youth leaders, office administrators, all of whom need to have training in some of the stuff that we're talking about today, because they're on, like you, they're also on the front line, whether they're staff or volunteers. Educational opportunities. We've got multiple settings for adult education and also, like even, for example, if you're the youth minister or children's minister, family minister, whatever your educator title might be, if there's a women's study group, why not offer to meet with them one time and talk about what you know about how kids are engaging or not engaging and the challenges that they face in this endemic time. You're the expert, and you've got grandparents in such groups. They may not, I mean, their own kids may be grown, but I bet they've got grandchildren, and you've got something to offer them. It's a great way to make some connections. Multiple topics, all kinds of things can be used in such educational opportunities. I think it's sometimes a thing that we, at least I do it as a church leader, sometimes take for granted, is that we are communities that are built on hope, and we have narratives of hope, that our faith traditions are built on stories of people overcoming adversity and finding meaning in life's hardships, whether they're the stories from our history or the stories from our communities or the communities of others. And those kinds of telling of those stories in the old African-American gospel song will tell the story how we got over, how we overcome. And we'll understand it better by and by. Telling the narratives of hope in a variety of ways. And also having our children and youth share their narratives of hope. Where have they found joy? Where have they found beauty? Where have they found hope in a increasingly challenging world? Also, sacred narratives of hope. Let me take just a moment and go through a couple of these really, really quickly. Again, you've got them on the PDF that was sent out. Hagar, we've already talked about. Twice she's driven out to the wilderness. Twice God shows up, offers her hope, offers her a well, offers her bread and food and water. Basic mental health techniques. You make sure that basic needs are met, and that contributes, basic physical needs are met, that contributes to basic mental health needs as well. Moses, he's exhausted by the people. He wants God to end his life. And God doesn't end his life, but God tells Moses to appoint 70 elders. In your faith community, for your teenagers, for your children, who can help share the load. Either share your load or the load that your families are experiencing. Ruth, Orpah, Naomi. I have to admit, this story of Ruth and Naomi in particular was a life giver for me, because of the deaths that I've experienced in my family as a kid growing up, and the fact that they kept on with their lives. They support one another, and they return to Bethlehem at the barley harvest, which is a sign of hope. How do we pair up older adults and younger adults, older adults, middle-aged adults, and teenagers or children as partners for hope? We have, at our church, we have something called a prayer child program, where every child and youth in the church is paired up with an adult who promises to pray for that child every day. They don't have to do anything more than that, but they promise to pray for the child. We have we have mentors for our youth initiation program. At one point, we have what we called a resident grandparents program. Older adults who would show up for kids' activities, because some of our kids don't have any grandparents, at least not close by. How do you do those cross-generational pairings up for care? I know in my own life, one of the life-giving things was as a young student intern, age 25, out in Arizona, my life was not going like I wanted to. The relationship had ended, and I wasn't sure I should be in seminary, and all the angst that I had as a 25-year-old. One of the life-saving things in that congregation was working with people who were really old, like 60s and 70s, and you'd had all kinds of experiences. The spouses had died, they'd lived through a depression, they'd lived through a world war, life didn't turn out as they wanted, and they weren't bitter, they hadn't given up, they were still engaged in life. For me, knowing those ancient people, those 65-year-olds, those 75-year-olds, those 85-year-olds, that gave me such hope as a 25-year-old and helped me put my life in perspective. Where else but our congregations do kids, children, and youth come in contact with people of other generations? And then the sacred narrative of hope of Ruth and Naomi, I think, is a wonderful story that underscores that. Elijah, he asks God to end his life because he's exhausted. God instead gives him food, water, and appoints Elisha to help. Basic mental health techniques. They're all in our sacred narratives of hope. There's a professor of psychiatry and religion at Illinois State University who is Jewish, and he's done a wonderful book called The Psychology of Hope, in which he compares the Greek mythologies or the Greek legends with the stories. The ones he does are all men, just stories of the biblical characters in the Hebrew Bible. As he says, I began to realize that in Greek mythology, people go through hard times and they kill themselves. whether it's Narcissus looking into the water, or the fall of the House of Usher, or Oedipus Rex, or whomever. People in the biblical scriptures, men in the biblical scriptures, Moses, Elijah, various other ones. There's only one instance of suicide in Hebrew scripture, and that's Saul. That's Saul when he doesn't want to be overtaken by his son's army and he falls on his sword, or doesn't want to be overtaken by David's army and falls on his sword. said, what's the difference? And then that's when he began to look at stories like Moses and Elijah and others, even the Jonah. Lots of people getting to the end of their rope, but not doing themselves in. And so he teased out some of these understandings as well. I've done some work on some of the women characters, both in Hebrew Bible and also in Christian scripture. And again, to say, there's something going on in our sacred narratives of hope that help people get through those hard times.
Letha?
Yeah.
This is Emily. I am just letting you know that I'm going to need to go. I'm sure there are many people here who can help you with what's in the chat and that kind of thing. Can unmute themselves. Okay.
How much longer do I have with these guys? I sort of.
So it ends at 3.
Ends at 3. Okay, that's what I thought. Okay, I'm almost done, and we'll take some chat things. I hope people are staying with us. I know it's a lot of material, and I don't particularly like being a talking head, but
they are, and they can unmute themselves and speak. Okay, great. Okay, thanks. The Christian. Let me go back. Christian narratives of hope. I've already talked about that. So, but again, that's part of our tradition. And also, I want to underscore this. Our sacred texts also address the societal and systemic issues of mental illness. There was a story that appears 3 times in the Gospels, and I mean on all 3 of the Synoptic Gospels, of the Gerardine or Gardinere demoniac, the man who is living in the tombs outside of a wealthy Roman city. Gerasene, most scholars think, is up in the northwestern corner of modern day Jordan. I've actually been there. The picture of the ruins is one I took. It was a very, very wealthy, big Roman city, known for its big buildings, known for it had swimming pools, it had temples, it had all kinds of things. But someone who had a mental illness had to live outside the city walls in the tombs. What does that say about society's care for persons with mental illness? Okay, so our sacred texts also, it's not only the one-on-one God showing up in somebody's life, it's also saying, okay, what are the reasons here for this situation? We also have congregational narratives of hope. The gospel song by Thomas Dorsey that ends with, we'll tell the story how we overcome and we'll understand it better by and by. We learn from one another in our congregations about resiliency, hope, and strength. I already talked about pairing older adults with younger adults, pairing parents whose children are grown with parents who are in the middle of it. Invite parents to share, you'll get through this messages with younger parents. And then also groups of persons going through loss or transition, including our kids. I mean, I don't know what your experience was growing up, but there wasn't anything about talking about what it means to lose a parent at a very early age when I was growing up. We can offer those kinds of opportunities in the groups that we offer. We also have worship as pastoral care. Both youth and adults and children can engage in sermons or delivering the message or developing services that are teaching moments around mental health concerns. In the time of prayer, whether it's in the close circle of our youth groups or in the wider community of faith, if we're going to pray for people who have cancer or who have diabetes or who have any other kind of physical illness, then we can also lift up in prayer those persons who are dealing with a mental illness. Granted, you've got to respect the confidentiality issues. You may not pray for a person, you may choose not to pray for confidential reasons for a person by their name, but you can certainly name, along with those other physical illnesses like schizophrenia, depression, and various other mental health issues. Music is an incredible mental health high. The research shows that that singing in particular, you take in all that oxygen, and also if you're singing with other people, your heart rate begins to become the same as the other people in the room. It's a way of connecting, and it's also a way of reminding us what people have done to get through those hard times. Rituals in our youth groups, in our children's ministry program, to engage in ritual as much as we do in our other in adult worship. We have ritual in the church I serve. We do a blessing of students and teachers as the school year begins. I want to start a blessing of the cars as the kids get driver's license. Various kinds of ways of acknowledging that we definitely do stuff at the end of the school year, but ways of acknowledging these are sacred times. We pray God's presence. We're not alone. Your own congregation, I bet, has rituals. You may not call them that, but I bet you do them. And those help people deal with grief and change and all of that. And finally, engaging children and youth. You guys know this as much as I do. Engaging children and youth in leadership roles, whether it's in worship or in service or anything else, lets us know, lets us as the person know, we're more than whatever our illness is or our family's illness is or whatever. And those are all protective factors. My hunch, your churches are already doing, you can just build on, that foster positive mental health. Worship of pastoral care. I'm going to skip over this one, but I think has already named some of it. But don't let mental health be just a one shot, one Sunday. Okay, now it's May, we're going to do Mental Health Sunday. Integrate it into the whole of your worship life. Advocacy and action. We can help change policy, and that also helps change us, because we get out of the sense that we can't do anything. And it's so important for any of us at any age, but also especially for, I think, young people. A couple things we've done. We have a motto at church at United as we've got faith in kids. And so we show up at all different kinds of events with that banner. And we also have been involved in some anti-bullying stuff with the local public schools. What are some things to advocate for? I think that in the same way that we advocate for housing or fair wages or whatever, we can be a voice for other kinds of mental health issues, treatment facilities, better funding, training for those who work with people at risk, like police officers or others, reducing the means, access to the means of suicide, bridge nets. It's a big controversy here in New Mexico around the Taos Bridge, guns, etc., and educating media around suicide prevention and messaging. And also, especially to make the connection between mental health issues and issues such as poverty, racism, other forms of discrimination that impact mental health. Stand in solidarity with communities that are dealing with either with the COVID virus or RSV or the virus of hate. I think that's a mental health action. That lets us know we're not alone in those challenges. Or suicide prevention among LGBTQ youth. Again, if the church names it, that's another ally. Basically, what I want to leave you with is build on your strengths, identify and strengthen what you're already doing, and then see what you can add to it, including training of your staff and lay leaders. But build on your strengths. You all are doing a lot. Take credit for it. And if you can, develop partnerships with mental health professionals. You may have some in your congregation. You may know others, whether it's public school, whether it's school counselors or others, rape, domestic violence or sexual violence capacities, agencies. Develop partnerships with them. Invite them into the church for adult education programs. Invite them to talk to your youth group. Bottom line, it's team effort. And it's a team effort, and it's worth taking the effort, because you, as a faith leader and also as part of a faith community, you offer multiple protective factors for fostering good mental health and suicide prevention. And we all need resources, training, acknowledgement for all of that. And it's even more important in this continuing Corona time to transform it into a Kairos time, time of God's time of faith, hope, and love. I'd like to close with this. There's one other prayer that I wrote that's at the end of the PowerPoint, but you have a copy of that. Stephen Charleston is a retired Episcopal bishop. He's also a Choctaw elder who grew up in Oklahoma. So he lives in both the Christian world and also in the native indigenous Choctaw world, and does a wonderful job of blending those two together. He's retired bishop of Alaska for the Episcopal Church. I love this prayer. Fill me again, Great Spirit, with all that I need to make it through this life of mine. Give me the vision I need to see clearly. Give me the strength I need to keep going. Give me the love I need to share what I have with others. Let me have a little courage and a lot of wisdom, as much hope as you can spare. Please give me your blessings again, dear Spirit, for I use them up so quickly in these shadowed times. Amen. And thank you all very, very much. I hope this has been, at least some part of it has been helpful to you. I'm sorry not to be able to see you in person, maybe next year in Jerusalem or wherever the meeting is. So I'm going to stop the share and then open it up for questions. Okay. Any, Okay, here's something someone said. Zoom has helped designating prayer partners, reinstated congregational meals, deacons call everyone just for a care call. Absolutely. Yep. Are there specific trainings I recommend for volunteers? There's a training called SPQ. It's it's a all day long suicide prevention training. Just Google SPQ and I think you'll find it. Also, various communities do offer a mental health first aid, which is sort of like like the Red Cross offers courses in first aid if you break your leg or get poison ivy or whatever. There's also courses that are offered in quote mental health first aid. And again, I think if you Googled it, you could probably find that in where it is in your own in your own community. Those would be the two ones that I would recommend. I also invite you to go to the National Suicide Prevention Action Alliance. I don't have the website right in front of me, but just Google that and that has a whole raft of resources, just sort of basic resources, some of which I shared today. It has resources for businesses, and also there is a fairly good size faith communities component called Faith, Hope, Love that has some of the biblical resources that I mentioned. It has some competency kinds of things, and you sort of just scan through that, and that can offer you some resources as well. One thing that I'd sent on to the organizers for this conference. One was a video that I helped produce. It's an interfaith video on caring for the caregivers, and I think if I can get people's email addresses from this presentation, I would like to send you that video plus a series of videos that I was a consultant for on, again, interfaith, but certainly relative to Christianity, on teenage youth and teenage mental health resources. So just to do some follow-up, I'm glad to be in touch. You can also probably you've been given, or you can be given my email address, and I'm more than glad to be in touch in this time. Last question, something about our churches might help those dealing with substance abuse disorder. Yes, it does definitely go hand in hand with mental illness. And the stigma is just as great, if not greater. Again, I think some of the things that we did, that I talked about earlier, about breaking the silence, about not blaming people, and also partnering with 12-step programs and other kinds of substance abuse programs, and also advocating for substance abuse programs in terms of the mental health resources that they need, that people need. It's not much of an answer. I think simply, again, in pastoral, in praying, for example, intercessory prayer, we will oftentimes include prayers for persons who are dealing with mental illness, those who are dealing with substance abuse, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't mean to be quite so flip with that, but just naming those demons in the middle of worship it signals to anyone who's sitting there, this is a safe place to talk about this kind of stuff. Okay, you have no idea how important that kind of messaging can be. Putting stuff up on your Facebook page or your Instagram or TikTok or whatever social, an ad in the print newspaper. So, okay. All right. Anything else? Any other? We're past the time that I'm supposed to be concluding. Is anybody from the organizers on this call? Hello. Is anybody still here? I'm only seeing 2 other people on my screen, so I appreciate Pam and Kathy for hanging in. I don't see anybody else. All right, I guess we're done. All right, be in touch if you want to be. Thank you so much. Blessings. Thank you for your work. Bye-bye.